Dr. Farris, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Minority Member, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am the co-founder of the Convention of States Project, a lawyer, been in practice now my 47th year. I've argued dozens of cases, constitutional cases in appellate courts, including the Supreme Court of Ohio, 2 cases in the Supreme Court of the United States. And I have litigated an Article 5 case on the amendment process back in the late 70s, early 80s, in a case that made it to the Supreme Court of the United States on the question of the extension of time on the Equal Rights Amendment. I represented 4 Washington state legislators in that case. So I'm one of the few lawyers in the country who've actually litigated an Article 5 case. I've also taught constitutional law at Patrick Henry College. 2 of my former students are now state solicitor generals, Indiana and West Virginia, and 5 of my students have clerked for the Supreme Court of the United States. I do that to say that a lot of lawyers claim to be constitutional lawyers, and my question to people making that claim is, show me the number of laws you had declared unconstitutional, and then we can talk. And so the constitutional issues in this case, or in this case, sorry, I'm used to this, in this legislation can be addressed today perhaps by asking 3 questions. Why did the founders create the process that we're seeking to use here? The second question is, do the current circumstances that we face in our country align with that purpose and that process? And third, is the process safe? And I'll briefly address all 3 of those questions. It was at the end of the Constitutional Convention process in the last week where George Mason observed that the proposed version of amending the Constitution that was in place at the time had a blind spot. And that is, all amendments were going to be proposed by Congress and all would be ratified by the state. And his speech to the convention basically said, Congress is never going to propose an amendment that limits its own power. And the founders in that day probably said something like, we hold that truth to be self-evident. If they were around today, they would say like, duh, and meant the same thing. And they immediately proposed the change to Article 5 that we now see, to give the states the ability to propose amendments for the express purpose of limiting the power of the federal government if the federal government gets out of hand. That's the reason we had it. It was one more layer of the checks and balances process. We don't want any agency in government, we don't want any level of government having too much power, and the ultimate ability to amend the Constitution essentially unilaterally, not by one state, but by ultimately 3/4 of the states, was a check on the misuse of federal power. That's why we have this process. So that takes me to the second question. Do our current circumstances align with that purpose? Well, I could give you a couple hours worth of reasons that that would be true, but I'm going to do 3 and do them briefly. First, the debt. We are experiencing debt that's in the 30s of trillion dollars, and if it's not exactly there today, it'll be 40 trillion all too soon. It's just out of control by anybody's estimation, and that's calling the debt that's on the books. If you take off the book debts, like all the money that's been borrowed from the Social Security system and not paid back, the actual number is closer to $150 trillion, an unimaginable number. And we've done that by spending for things that are not within the competence of the federal government. And that all comes back to a Supreme Court case. If you want to know which case caused all this, the Butler did it. It's United States versus Butler, where the court said federal spending was not limited to the enumerated powers. If federal spending was limited to the enumerated powers, we would essentially have no federal debt. We would certainly not have the kind of federal debt that we're looking at today. I'll take a second example, education. Years ago, I was litigating a homeschool case in New York, and I walked from the State Department of Education, past the city offices, past the regional office called BOCES, down to the federal offices where the litigation was going on. And I realized that every single level of government that I had just passed had a Department of Education. We do not get more services for kids. My dad was a retired public school principal. We don't get more services for kids by having multiple departments of education. We get more bureaucrats. The founders never gave education as an enumerated power to the federal government. They take our money from the states, they take it to Washington, D.C., they send a small portion of that money back to the states with strings and effectively run the educational programs of the schools. About, on average, 5% of school funding comes from the federal government, and 55% of the rules come from the federal government. It is an out-of-control situation. If we returned that whole process, took it away from the federal government, reduce the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, we would have that problem solved on that particular issue. We're getting the feds out of it and get back to just state and local government dealing with education issues. Third example, one is a special favorite of mine ever since I ended up getting an LLM in Public International Law from the University of London, is the treaty process has just gone awry in our country. Our country adopts about 200 treaties a year. 95% of them never are sent to the Senate for ratification. Some years a little more, some years a little less, but the vast majority of treaties are signed either by the president alone or by the Secretary General of the not the Secretary General, but the U.S. Ambassador to the UN or some other diplomatic person. We call them executive agreements. That's a term that the Supreme Court and the State Department collectively made up. In international law, all executive agreements are treaties, but we do not treat treaties the way we do. The reason I do this, I'm sure you're getting inquiries from constituents about the upcoming WHO treaty that President Biden has indicated that he's going to sign as an executive agreement in April. And that treaty turns jurisdiction over from the states over pandemics to the federal government under the general supervision of the United Nations World Health Organization. And so that's the way treaties work. Under the necessary and proper clause, once a treaty's been adopted, then the power to implement that treaty goes to the agency that adopted it. That's the federal government, that's Congress. And so what we saw in the COVID pandemic, the states had the ability to vary their processes. We lose that under this treaty, and we lose it without so much as a vote in the Senate. We can stop the federal government from doing this end run around the provision of the Constitution that says all treaties should be ratified by the U.S. Senate by a simple fix that effectively overrides the case that the Supreme Court made on this, which was called United States versus Pink. So those are three examples of how we need to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, impose limitations on the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. The third topic you'll hear about from others under the application that's before you is term limits on federal officials. I'm not going to address that separately. I'm going to address just briefly the third question: is this process safe? The original process that we were given was checks and balances against the federal government, but there are checks and balances built into this process that prevent this process from going awry as well. In order to have a convention, you have to have 2/3 of the states agree on a topic for the convention. The application that's in front of you has been passed verbatim by 19 other states. And Kansas is maybe 20, but that's a long story. But 19 for sure. And so there's no question about aggregation, but we can't add that to other treaties that have been, or excuse me, not treaties, but applications that have been proposed over time. There have been 450 applications for a convention over the course of history. The vast majority of them are still valid and in effect. And if 34 applications on any old topic was okay, then we'd have had a convention a long time ago. That's never been the case. We've always had the rule that you have to have agreement on the topic. So when we get to 34 states, agreement on the topic, then you can have a convention. Well, what's to prevent the convention from changing the rules at the time? The question arises because the argument's usually made. The original Constitutional Convention was a runaway convention. They didn't stick to their topic. Why will this happen? Well, that's just simply a historical lie. That's not what happened. I wrote the definitive answer to that argument in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. You can get it online for free. I have a few copies here today if you'd like to see them or have them. And it's called Defying Conventional Wisdom, How the Original Constitutional Convention Was Not a Runaway. And if you put my last name, Farris, in, and the phrase Defying Conventional Wisdom, you can get it for free on the internet from the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. The basic answer is The states called the convention, and here's what the states told their delegates to do: render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. The phrase, only amend the Articles of Confederation, comes from a resolution by Congress that has the power and effect of a National Pickle Week resolution. It was basically Congress giving their opinion, because under the Articles of Confederation, Congress didn't have any power to call any conventions. They had very limited power. And so the states called the convention. They told them to render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union, and that's what they did. The idea that they were only supposed to amend the articles is a flat historical lie that defames the Constitution of the United States. People who call themselves constitutionalists on the one hand, and then claim the Constitution was a result of a runaway convention, are engaged in intellectual schizophrenia at a pretty deep level. The checks and balances say, start with 2/3, agreement on the subject matter. And then you go to the convention. It's one state, one vote. It can't be proportional representation, because that's a Congress, not a convention. A convention of states, every convention of states that has ever been held in this country, and there have been many, it's always one state, one vote. In fact, it's a term of international law. Every international convention is one state, one vote. We call them states in international law. And that phrase carries on. It's one state, one vote. That's a structural change. But 26 states, a majority, at the convention can approve a proposed text. Then it goes to the state legislatures. 38 states have to ratify. Now, that means if a single house in 13 states vote no, it's over. You lose, because it requires 38. So 13, one house going off and saying, no, we don't want this, that defeats that state. So 13 no votes in 13 chambers, we're done. The only way you can do this is if you have a sensible amendment, because it is very hard to do something good in this process. Very hard. Not impossible, but very hard. It is impossible to do anything crazy. Just, you can't get it done. The structure that's in place is so solid. You cannot do something crazy. Now, there are two kinds of groups that are saying the opposite. One on the far right, one on the far left. On the far right, they're basically functional anarchists. They don't trust any government whatsoever. They don't trust this government. They don't trust their city council. They say every government's illegitimate. They're all doing the wrong thing. It's all bad. We can't run a country with functional anarchists in control. Just doesn't work. And they're saying that the checks and balances won't work because they don't trust any government at any point in time. The other group on the left, they're people that love centralized government. The more centralized, the better it is, including world government. They love things like turning over our pandemics to the federal government under the supervision of the UN. And so those people are also singing this runaway convention. You can't control it. You can't control it if your goal is functional anarchy. You can't control it if your goal is massive centralized government. Their arguments flow from their premises. Their premises are dangerous to this country. We do not want functional anarchy. We want a nation that works. And we do not want centralized runaway government. And that's what we've got in Washington, D.C. right now. We need to do the kind of government that works. That is a constitutional republic where there are limited powers at each level of government and there are functional checks and balances. The founders of this country gave every member of this committee and every member of this legislature authority to act. With that authority to check the power and abuse of the federal government, I suggest that you have the moral responsibility to do so. I would encourage you to vote favorably in this legislation. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.